The courtroom was packed, but you could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett as she stood at the plaintiff's table, confident, composed, and radiating a quiet defiance. The case she was about to argue wasn't just another routine civil dispute. It was an explosive corruption case tied directly to the city's elite. At the center of the controversy stood Charles L. Granger, a shadowy figure in real estate who was accused of siphoning public development funds into his own offshore accounts and presiding over it all. Judge Ronald Hayward, a man whose reputation for delivering harsh, often prejudiced rulings was whispered about in legal circles but rarely challenged. From the moment Jasmine introduced her opening statement, it was clear Judge Hayward had already made up his mind. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the bench, with a smirk that reeked of disdain. Every time Jasmine spoke, he interrupted. Every time she produced a document or referenced case law, he scoffed. When she mentioned systemic misuse of city grants and named Granger's financial connections to officials, Hayward banged his gavel, not to maintain order, but to cut her off. Then came the insult, with Jasmine mid-sentence, laying out the timeline of missing funds. Hayward leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension, and questioned whether someone with her background could even grasp the intricacies of a case this complex. Gasps echoed through the room. What was coded language to some was a blatant slap to others. Jasmine paused, not because she was shaken, but because she was choosing her next move with precision. The gallery tensed. The insult wasn't just personal, it was historic. It echoed decades of silencing, of women of color being told they didn't belong in places of power. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, and her posture straightened. She asked the court stenographer to read back Hayward's comment, and when the words rang out again in the sterile courtroom air, the message was clear. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Judge Hayward tried to move forward as if nothing had happened, instructing her to proceed or sit down. But Jasmine had something else in mind. She turned to her briefcase and pulled out a stack of sealed files. Calmly, she asked the court to permit the entry of new evidence, emails and transaction records obtained legally that implicated Granger. Directly in redirecting redevelopment funds meant for low-income housing projects. Hayward's reaction was immediate and unprofessional. He loudly accused her of grandstanding, of using the court as a platform for political theatrics. But she remained unbothered. That's when Jasmine said she had something else, something far more damning. With controlled fury, she announced she would be playing an audio recording taken during a private dinner between Granger and several unnamed officials, one of whom she strongly implied was sitting on the bench before her. The courtroom erupted. Reporters started scribbling. Bailiffs looked at each other, unsure of what was about to go down. Hayward's expression shifted from irritation to something far more dangerous: panic. The judge quickly ordered a recess, slamming his gavel down so hard it cracked the wood. But Jasmine refused to yield. She reminded the court that judicial obstruction of evidence presentation was itself a punishable offense. She then asked for an emergency judicial review, citing bias and misconduct from the bench. The gallery murmured in approval. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning in real time. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Judge Hayward retreated to his chambers, visibly rattled. Jasmine remained in place, calmly organizing her materials. She knew what she had was bigger than any one case. She wasn't just exposing Granger. She was peeling back the veneer of legitimacy from an entire system that allowed people like Hayward to thrive. And the best part? She hadn't even played the tape yet. The atmosphere shifted the moment recess ended. What had started as a routine hearing was now the city's most volatile legal drama, and everyone in the courtroom felt it. Spectators returned to their seats with nervous anticipation. Reporters angled their recorders toward the bench, and even the bailiffs stood stiff, aware that the next few minutes could change careers, maybe even lives. Jasmine Crockett stood alone, undeterred. Her posture screamed defiance, her eyes locked on the bench where Judge Hayward had just resumed his seat. Gone was the smug expression from earlier. In its place was a tight-lipped grimace, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Jasmine calmly asked for permission to play the audio evidence. Predictably, Judge Hayward denied the request, citing procedural irrelevance, but this time his voice trembled. Jasmine pounced, reminding the court that suppression of relevant evidence, particularly in a corruption trial involving public funds, was a gross violation of due process. She demanded a ruling from a higher judicial panel to review Hayward's repeated obstruction. But she didn't stop there. Without breaking eye contact, she leaned into the microphone and declared that, regardless of Hayward's denial, the content of the recording had already been submitted to the State Bar, the Judicial Review Board, and several reputable media outlets. Her voice, calm but firm, echoed throughout the courtroom like a warning shot. Hayward blinked, the blood visibly draining from his face. Then she pressed play. The room fell silent. The recording began innocuously enough, clinking glasses, idle banter between powerful men over dinner. But then came the bombshell. Clear as day, Charles Granger could be heard boasting about how the judge had cleaned up several cases for him in exchange for campaign donations, private real estate deals, and, worst of all, access to confidential city planning proposals before they went public. Gasps swept through the room like wildfire. The sound of Hayward's name being mentioned directly in connection with falsified rulings and manipulated case outcomes hit like a sledgehammer. His face froze in horror. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Jasmine had effectively detonated a legal grenade right in the middle of his courtroom. Desperation set in fast. Judge Hayward slammed his gavel, his voice cracking as he ordered the audio to be stricken from the record. He declared the court in contempt, threatened sanctions, and accused Jasmine of illegally obtaining the recording, despite her earlier proof of lawful acquisition. But it didn't matter anymore. The courtroom had turned on him. The gallery erupted. Reporters shot out of their seats to begin live updates. Several jury members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether they were still participating in a trial or witnessing a full-scale implosion of the judicial system. And Jasmine? She remained composed. With surgical precision, she then submitted banking records from the last 5 years, records that showed deposits from Granger's shell companies into accounts belonging to entities tied to Hayward's family. She laid it all out like a carefully woven tapestry of greed, bias, and betrayal. Hayward lashed out again, shouting that she was politicizing the bench, that she was unfit to practice law. His insults grew sharper, uglier, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she called upon the ethics officer seated in the courtroom, who had been silently observing since the start. She asked for immediate suspension proceedings. Then came the moment that flipped the entire room. From the back of the courtroom, 2 federal marshals stepped forward. No one breathed. The marshals walked directly to the bench, produced a sealed order, and handed it to Judge Hayward. His hands shook as he read it. The order was clear. He was under federal investigation for obstruction of justice, bribery, and judicial misconduct. He was to be escorted from the courtroom immediately and held for questioning. A murmur spread like thunder. Jasmine stood tall, watching the once invincible man scramble to defend himself, raising his voice in a pathetic attempt to deflect blame. But there was no one left to back him up. Not his bailiff, not the lawyers, and certainly not the people. The mask had fallen. As Hayward was led away in cuffs, the courtroom exploded into shocked whispers and applause. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply gathered her files. Knowing this moment would ripple far beyond the 4 walls of that courtroom, she hadn't just won a motion, she had struck at the heart of a rotting institution, and the tremors were just beginning. As Judge Hayward disappeared through the courtroom doors, shackled and surrounded by marshals, the silence left in his wake was suffocating. The gallery, unsure whether to cheer or sit frozen in disbelief, found themselves witnessing something few had ever imagined, a judge once untouchable being dragged from his own bench in disgrace by the very system he thought he controlled. But Jasmine Crockett knew better than to think the fight was over. Moments after the spectacle caught, officials scrambled in a panic, trying to figure out who would take over the proceedings. Defense attorneys, once smug in their assumption of victory, now clung to procedural lifelines. And in the chaos, A new threat began to rise. Retaliation. Not through shouting or accusations, but through something far more sinister. Character. Assassination. Barely an hour had passed before news outlets began running headlines that hinted at Jasmine's possible ethical violations. Anonymous sources claimed she had personal motivations for targeting Hayward. A former client appeared on a shady livestream, suggesting she had once accepted legal fees in cash. The timing wasn't just suspicious, it was surgical. It was clear that the machinery of the elite had activated. They couldn't beat Jasmine in the courtroom, so they turned to the court of public opinion. But she saw it coming. Before those smear attempts gained traction, Jasmine held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras crowded around her, as she laid out the facts with devastating clarity. She described how her office had been receiving threats for weeks leading up to the case. She revealed emails from anonymous addresses warning her not to go after Granger. And then, like clockwork, she displayed screenshots of the smear campaign's first seeds. Emails sent from political operatives tied to a local law enforcement union, one with deep connections to Hayward himself. Her words weren't just fierce. They were fireproof. She came armed with proof, recordings, screenshots and timelines, exposing the desperate scramble of a crumbling network trying to save itself by torching the woman who held the match. Inside the courthouse, as the trial resumed under a newly appointed and visibly shaken judge, Jasmine returned to her seat. Granger, pale and sweating, leaned toward his attorneys, whispering furiously. The confidence he'd once displayed was gone. His team tried to motion for a mistrial, but the new judge, likely aware of the public scrutiny now hanging over the case like a noose, rejected it without hesitation. Jasmine wasted no time. With Granger's former accountant now flipping under immunity and freshly subpoenaed bank records arriving by the hour, the noose tightened fast. Every piece of evidence she presented was more damning than the last. Shady wire transfers, real estate deeds, paper trails linking city officials to illegal property flips. It was a symphony of corruption, and Jasmine was conducting it with chilling precision. Granger's team began to unravel. One lawyer requested a delay citing emotional distress. Another tried to strike every piece of evidence Jasmine submitted, but the new judge, keen to avoid the fate of his predecessor, allowed nearly everything through. And in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, unbending, untouched, unapologetic, the same men who tried to insult her, silence her and smear. Her were now shrinking in real time. Their power was evaporating. Their arrogance had turned into paranoia. And Jasmine made it clear she wasn't finished. During the next recess, reporters tried to corner her, throwing out baiting questions about whether she was pushing a political agenda. She didn't flinch. Instead, she dropped one final bombshell. A second tape. The room froze. She didn't reveal what was on it, not yet. But she confirmed its existence, and its contents, she said, implicated not just Hayward and Granger, but city council members, real estate executives, and one former district attorney. The panic was instant. Phones lit up across the courthouse. Some people walked out. Others whispered frantically. Jasmine just watched. She had exposed a web of corruption so deep that the justice system itself was starting to convulse. But her message remained simple. This was no longer about her. This was about what happened when the voiceless stood up, and the system finally had to listen. And still, the best was yet to come. By the time the trial reached its final stretch, the courtroom felt more like a battleground than a place of law. Security presence doubled. Extra reporters were granted access. Whispers filled the hallways about resignations, secret meetings, and who would fall next. Jasmine Crockett had done more than expose corruption. She had shaken the entire legal infrastructure to its core, and now she was ready to tear down what was left of it. On the morning of closing arguments, Jasmine walked into court with one final file clutched in her hand. No theatrics, no bold declarations, just a quiet confidence that unnerved the entire defense table. Granger barely looked up. His lawyers were husks of their former selves, resigned to the inevitable. They had thrown everything at her: insults, threats, smear campaigns, procedural roadblocks, and she was still standing taller than ever. Then came the second recording. This time she didn't wait for permission. She walked straight to the evidence table and handed it over, stating clearly and loudly for the record, this tape would expose a conspiracy involving not only Judge Hayward and Charles Granger, but also 2 sitting city council members and a former district attorney who had all used their power to funnel public redevelopment funds into private luxury projects while evicting dozens of low-income families. The courtroom went silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't shock, it was surrender. The lies had unraveled too fast, too violently to keep up appearances any longer. The tape played. It was worse than anyone expected. On the recording, Judge Hayward could be heard laughing about making Jasmine crawl in court, joking with council members about stalling cases until plaintiffs ran out of money. It was candid, cruel, and conclusive. Voices on the tape confirmed collusion, case manipulation, and even bribes involving real estate executives laundering money through shell construction firms. This wasn't misconduct. It was organized corruption. The tape ended. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. The new judge recessed immediately, promising to forward the evidence to the Department of Justice. Granger's lead attorney quit on the spot, and within an hour, 3 arrest warrants were issued. 2 for city officials, 1 for the former. The fallout was explosive. Media vans surrounded the courthouse. Protesters gathered outside with signs bearing Jasmine's name. Civil rights groups demanded audits of every case Judge Hayward had ever ruled on. A task force was formed overnight. The governor's office issued a public statement praising the courage of whistleblowers and advocates of judicial transparency. But everyone knew what that really meant. They were scared. The system had been cracked open, and now people were running for cover. Inside the courthouse, as Jasmine quietly packed her notes, a young woman, clerk, maybe a paralegal, approached her with tears in her eyes and simply said, "Thank you." Jasmine nodded but said nothing. Her work wasn't done. In the following weeks, she continued her crusade, reviewing old cases Hayward had mishandled, pushing for compensation for families displaced by Granger's illegal real estate projects, and even testifying before a judicial review panel. Her name was everywhere, but she didn't crave the spotlight. She wanted justice. And for the first time in a long time, people were actually listening. But perhaps the most powerful moment came 3 weeks after the trial ended. Judge Hayward, awaiting formal charges in federal custody, issued a public statement through his lawyer, a weak attempt to paint himself as a scapegoat. He claimed he was misled, that he was pressured into rulings. But the public didn't buy it. Jasmine responded with a simple press release that included 6 words burned into the memory of every person who had followed the case. "You called me unqualified. Now look." And with that, the courtroom saga ended, not as a story of revenge, but of righteous, unstoppable accountability. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a trial. She had dismantled an empire built on arrogance, greed, and racism. And as for the judge who once tried to belittle her, he ended up exactly where he belonged, on the wrong side of justice, wearing the very handcuffs he once wielded like a weapon.